Eufameito passa i ther, que cai pontos cai pnoiai, ure a tempe asigato, ejoi zongoi tornizon, melei garpros gemas vaini, foibos acersecomas euhaitas.
Über Heraklit zu sprechen, ist für jeden
To talk about Heraclitus is an extraordinarily fascinating business for any thinking person, not just for a professor of philosophy. It is true that his book is known to us only in fragments, but even in antiquity, Heraclitus was one of the most famous authors of the Greek period. He was called the Obscure, for his propositions were of epigrammatic brevity. They had a very strange, cryptic, and yet always stimulating tone. And even in antiquity, reference was made, especially by Plato, to Heraclitus. And Hegel, Nietzsche, and Heidegger, three great thinkers in the modern German cultural tradition, in a certain sense saw in Heraclitus a true ideal of speculative profundity.
Ein wahres Ideal spekulativen Tiefsinns gesehen haben. Von Hegel ist der Satz
Hegel's statement has come down to us. There is not a single proposition in Heraclitus which I could not have included in my philosophical logic.
Umso schwieriger aber.
But it becomes more difficult if one tries to go into the texts which have come down to us, for they are all quotations. We do not have a coherent text. although we must assume that there was a coherent text and not just a collection of aphorisms, as was thought, for instance, in the late 19th century under Nietzsche's influence. Why are we so certain that it was a coherent text and not just discrete propositions? We know purely by chance, as is often the case in history. The fact is that Aristotle quoted the first sentence of this book word for word, not for reasons of philosophical sympathy, much less out of affinity with Heraclitus's own peculiar profundity, but rather because the punctuation of this first sentence was unclear. I will read out the sentence. It is fragment 1 in the well-known collection of the pre-Socratics, which today is just as out of date as it is ubiquitous. The quotation runs,
Tude logo tude ontos ai axynetoi ginontai anthropoi, kai prosten eacusai, kai accusantes to proton.
With reference to this logos, this dictum, which we have here, which always is,
das immer ist, zeigen sich die Menschen
people are uncomprehending, both before they have heard it and after they have heard it for the first time too. Aristotle's question was, where does this always belong? To the logos which always is, or to this logos which always is and to which people always react with incomprehension? You see how trivial the process of historical handing down sometimes is. Because this sentence begins as it does and continues in later quotations, we know for certain that there was a coherent text and not a series of aphorisms. Now, this is indeed a strange introduction. Of course, it was usual in Greek because, as we know, there were no title pages and there was no printing. Generally, one proceeded from the spoken word, whether as the listener to a speaker, or whether one read out loud oneself from a text on papyrus. This was the method of reading in antiquity. We know how St. Augustine admired Bishop Ambrosius of Milan because he could read without speaking out loud. I have said this first to explain why Aristotle here puts an unanswerable question. Where does this word always belong? If you read the sentence, this logos, which always is, and which people always do not understand. If you hear this in Greek, insofar as I, that is to say, always, could belong to either, you do not notice any difference, because it belongs to both parts. This is a very unusual case, and one can say that Aristotle, because he was already too much of a reader and not a listener anymore, needed to ask about the punctuation. Perhaps it is not generally known that punctuation, commas and full stops and the like, was not originally present in the Greek texts at all. Punctuation is a reading crutch for those who need it. And for the living ear of a Greek listener, it was not necessary if the reader, the speaker, was a really good speaker and understood what he was saying. So this is how Heraclitus' book begins. This logos is not understood by most people, and even when they have heard the message, which is expounded in the logos, even then they still do not understand. And so I will, as it were, and this is how the text continues, try to explicate it.
Auseinanderzusetzen. Hokoion ego die goemai kataphysen die heireon hekaston kai fratson hokos echai. Indem ich
by taking each point as it is, analyzing and explaining how it fits in. Now this hardly promises very profound utterances. But one should be suspicious as to whether this proposition is really as innocent as it sounds. Because anyone can utter such a trivial introduction to a text. I intend to recount everything exactly and demonstrate how it all fits in. But if perhaps the ensuing book, the text, does something very different from merely distinguishing various things from one another and showing how they relate, if, on the contrary, what follows stresses over and over again that no matter what you separate out, everything is basically one, basically the same, then one glimpses the profundity of such an author, who seemingly hides behind his pedantic turn of phrase. I will discuss very precisely how everything fits in by nicely distinguishing one thing from another. In reality, he is saying, for everything is one. Now, in order to make it clear to you that this is the real message of Heraclitus, may I draw your attention to another text. Of course, it is also only something which belongs to later tradition, like most of the fragments. It is not important to listen to me. But to listen to the logos and to follow it, that which is wise and true, namely, en panta enai, that everything is one. Here we are immediately confronted with Heraclitus' basic term, to sophon. It actually means the wise thing, that which only the wise man knows, that is, what is true. It is fascinating to see how Heraclitus manifestly presents us with this, his uniform message, in countless variations. As we know, he talks of the river, which one goes into over and over again as the same river, although it is always new water that swirls past one. Or again, when one speaks of how quickly things change, how the face of reality is transformed, as at a stroke.
Der Anblick der Wirklichkeit sich verändert. Ein klassisches Beispiel.
A classic example of this is war and peace.
Und Frieden. Unser geplagtes
Our
Jahrhundert
troubled century,
für uns
for the older of us,
hat uns ja
has demonstrated this piece of visual instruction all too vividly,
geführt, wie sich die Welt
that the world changes in a twinkling, when the peaceful relations of one country with its neighbors are transformed into war.
Sich in einen Kriegszustand verwandelt. Und wie nur
And how, under the rule of this war, all human effort is channeled into one direction.
Alle Anstrengungen der Menschen dem einen Ziele gelten. Und doch kann man,
and yet, if you think about it, is it in the nature of true human relations to live through a time of war?
Diesen Kriegszustand zu durchleben? Gewiss.
Certainly, war poses a great test. If we, for instance, in our modern society, often bemoan with a certain regret the lack of human solidarity, then I could tell of the opposite effect from the time of my childhood and youth, the two great world wars. Then the dangers of war and the pressure under which we all lived produced real solidarity. And of course, sometimes a lack of solidarity. And people are people everywhere. But it really was a very deep feeling of common purpose which was produced. For instance, everyone knows that in war and among soldiers, a sort of code of honor and a deep sense of obligation to stand by the individual exists. If someone is wounded, for example, these are well-known facts. Briefly, this example of war and peace clearly does not represent the whole of reality. In other words, the one war which now obtains, or the one peace which then takes over. In truth, both are the one. The dangers of war and the tasks of peace. This is human life. Heraclitus, as we know, lived in a warlike and dangerous world. He lived on the coast of Asia Minor, where the impending pressure of Persian dominion was already very much to be felt. Indeed, a few decades later, it was led to the great commercial towns on the coast of Asia Minor losing their political freedom. Now, I'm going into this just to say how remarkable what Heraclitus says here is. On the one hand, he talks of the river and how everything flows by, so that, according to later writers, in all probability interpreting Heraclitus very one-sidedly, his teaching was of the flux of all things. If we look at the evidence, however, we see that his teaching was the paradox, that which is always different water flowing over the river bed is one and the same river. Thus, the true profundity of Heraclitus' teaching, which he is also professing here, is not to make the distinction, this is war and this is peace, or this is hunger and this is satiation. There is also a fine example which we all are familiar with. As the proverb says, hunger is the best sauce. Or conversely, we find that when we are full, even the most tasty dish cannot tickle our appetite anymore. So once again we see a proximity of opposites, which, despite all their oppositeness, belong indissolubly together. As we know, this is the lesson which Plato drew from Heraclitus. And to pretend to be cleverer than Plato is presumptuous enough. Even more presumptuous, considering that Plato knew Heraclitus's book, whereas we know only isolated quotations. And you can prove almost anything with quotations. And so the diligent authors who quoted Heraclitus in antiquity attempted, with one accord, to illustrate or back up their own ideas with Heraclitus's quotations. To understand a quotation, you have to ask, first of all, why is it being cited? What is its context? For this reason, I regard the usual collections of fragments from Heraclitus as crudely misleading. You read the basic propositions one after another, and you therefore forget that the message of these propositions was once cited by a writer for a particular purpose. I'm not saying that the purpose for which the citation may have been made is necessarily the same as the text's original meaning. That, of course, would be naive. But how can we get to know more exactly what Heraclitus really had in mind, other than, for example, by inquiring of the first notable reader of Heraclitus, whose writings are known to us? And this would be Plato, who said quite clearly, that which can be decomposed and divided into constituents belongs at the same time together. There are countless examples. The barley swill that is not stirred up decomposes. So it is a single dynamic which produces this, the dynamic of decomposition. One really could cite countless examples. But the real philosophical challenge in the case of Heraclitus is, what sort of a message is this which maintains that everything is one? It is difficult to present a reasonable selection of the most relevant propositions. But in this short hour, I would like to focus on something meaningful and relevant to everyone. As you might expect, the quotation that I am going to give you is a further example of the one that underlies the apparently separate and antithetical.
Das in dem scheinbar getrennten und gegensätzlichen zugrunde liegt. Wo ist wohl etwas?
Where can we get a personal experience of this? Certainly, the examples I have given, that one is suddenly completely full and one's appetite deserts one, or that there is suddenly a war and the face of life is radically transformed. Things happening at a stroke like this. Now, in what area of experience do we feel this as the most profound and unsolvable riddle? I would say we might all agree that it is in sleeping and waking. It is an astonishing fact that one wakes up and is immediately oneself, or at least comes to oneself.
Oder man kommt wenigstens zu sich, ebenso wenn man aus einer Ohnmacht aufwacht. Es gibt auch den anderen.
It is just the same when one recovers from a faint.
Ebenso.
There is also the other, clear and incontrovertible and conclusive process of change, and that is death. The living body becomes a corpse. Let us take a quotation which illustrates this for us in a very profound way, and which is, by the way, also linguistically extremely interesting. The text runs,
Anthropos en euphrone phaos haptetai heauto.
This means, in the night, a person strikes a light.
Zündet sich ein Licht an. Apospestais opsais.
When the eyes are extinguished. Suddenly, the most trivial thing in the world, that a person strikes a light in the night, acquires a completely different dimension of meaning. When the eyes are extinguished. This may be because they have closed in sleep, or because death has closed them forever. Now let us read on.
Hinter diesem Apospestais opsais.
In between there is a word that I will leave out because it just stands for dark. Now how does this fragment go on?
Zum de haptetai tetne otos heido.
While living, one touches on death in sleeping.
Wenn man schläft. Sie kennen das alle, dass wir
Everyone knows that we say to sleep like the dead. And metaphorically, we speak of the eternal sleep into which the dead have passed. I repeat, while living, one touches on death in sleep.
Egregoros haptetai heudontos.
Awake, we touch on the sleeper.
An den Schlafenden. Wieder ist etwas Sonderbares.
Again, something has been turned around remarkably. First of all, living touches on death in deep sleep. And being awake touches on the sleeper. And in the background evidently stands death as the last sudden finality.
Plötzliche Endgültigkeit.
What does this sentence tell us? I think it presents us with a particularly important experience. The enigmatic dividing line between that which is so enigmatically inseparable. Waking and sleep. Sleep and waking. Living and death. Life and death. We can hardly say that the peaceful rhythm of change from waking to sleeping and its converse from sleeping to waking, to being awake, fully corresponds to the mystery of death, the irreversible final cessation of life.
Des unumkehrbaren, endgültigen Aufhörens des Lebens und des Seins des Toten. Oder haben Lebende
But do the
und
living and the
Tote
dead not
vielleicht
perhaps
doch
possess an indivisible
auch noch
unity?
eine untrennbare Einheit? Hier müssen wir uns natürlich
We must
hüten,
be on our guard
etwa
here with
christliche
reference to Christian concepts of
der
immortality,
Unsterblichkeit
in the sense of
im
the
Sinne
Christian message of the
der
resurrection of the
christlichen
dead.
Botschaft von der Auferstehung der Toten fernzuhalten. Es ist klar, dass man
It is
auch
clear that there are certain of
gewisse
Heraclitus'
Sätze, die
propositions
hat man so
which have been
verstanden,
interpreted
vor
in
allen
this
Dingen, wenn
way,
man ein christlicher Kirchenvater war.
particularly by the
Dann
Church
hat man gewisse
Fathers.
Sätze zitiert, da richten
Certain
sich die
propositions have been
Bilder der
quoted,
Toten auf,
then the images of the dead
lenken das
arise
Leben
and direct the
der
life of
Lebenden.
the living.
Es gibt so ein Fragment. Ich spreche
There is
frei
such a
darüber,
fragment which I
möchte
am
hier
rendering
nicht
freely.
pedantisch immerfort im Buch
I
blättern.
don't want to keep on
Und
leafing
Zitate
through the
werden
book
auch
in a
im
pedantic
Allgemeinen
manner.
nicht schlechter, dadurch, dass man sie falsch zitiert. Sie bekommen sozusagen
And generally
ein
speaking,
unmittelbares Leben
quotations are
im
not
Zuge
harmed by being
des
misquoted.
Gedankengangs. So würde ich
They
also auch zu
acquire, as it
diesem
were, an
sollten
immediate
es sagen.
vitality in the course of the thought process.
Richten sich Gestalten auf, die das Leben
So, with reference to this
der
fragment,
Lebenden,
then the forms arise that direct the
das
lives of the
könnte
living.
auch heißen,
I would say it could mean
dass
that in the memories
im
of those who are living
Gedächtnis
still,
derer, die
their
weiterleben,
ancestors, their
ihre
forefathers,
Vorderen, wie
determine
wir
their
früher
lives
im
either by example
alten Deutsch sagten,
or by
unsere
means
Vorfahren
of what they have spiritually bequeathed.
uns vorbildhaft oder auch nur durch ihre eigene Hinterlassenschaft bestimmen. Es könnte also durchaus so sein,
It could also well
dass wir
be
hier
that
auch
we
zwischen
have here
Leben
too
und Tod
a sort of reciprocal relation
eine
between
Art
life
von
and death.
Wechselverhältnis finden.
And in this connection,
Und dann gibt es in
there
der
is
Tat die
one of the most
interessantesten
interesting
Fragmente,
fragments.
die Unsterblichen
The immortals live
sterben,
the death
andere
of
leben,
mortals,
die leben,
and
die
mortals
Lebenden
die
sterben
the life
unter
of the
ihrem
immortals.
Tod. Also, hier wird von den Menschen und
Here
den
the
Göttern,
topic is human beings and the
Menschen.
gods.
indem sie leben,
Living men extinguish the
Sterben
life
sie.
of the gods.
die Götter,
The gods live
wenn sie
when
leben,
they,
wenn
human
sie
beings,
gestorben sind.
have died.
Wieder scheint ein
Again, there seems to be an
untrennbares
indissoluble
Verhältnis
relation
bestehen
between mortals
zwischen
and
den Lebenden
immortals.
und den Unsterblichen. Denn das sind
The
für die
latter
Griechen
are, for the Greeks, the
die
gods,
den Tod kennen,
who, living, know death.
gerade indem sie am Leben sind, das würden wir auch so sagen, leben
We could also
in
say
gewissem Sinne
living,
ihren
in a sense, in
Tod
perpetual oblivion of death.
vergessen. Und ebenso die
And
ihres
similarly,
Todes
it is those who are, so
sozusagen
to speak,
gewiss sind
certain
oder
that they will
nahe
die,
für die
or are close to
denken
death.
sie an
It
die
is they
Unsterblichen,
who think of the immortals
die
who will
ihnen
never
dieses
face
Ende
impending
nie
death.
bevorsteht. Sie sehen am Beispiel wiederum,
This example
an
shows
welche
once again
tiefsinnigen,
how
offenen
profound this issue
religiösen
is,
Traditionen aller
a problem
Völker
which the religious
mit
traditions of all
Antworten
peoples
besetztes
have
Problem
proffered answers to,
des menschlichen Daseins
namely
hier
the
eine Rolle
human
spielt.
condition itself,
Die Endlichkeit, wie wir im Deutschen
man's
sagen, des
finiteness,
Menschen,
as we say,
wie Heidegger
as Heidegger
in seiner
so
Philosophie
expressively
so
articulated it in his
suggestiv
philosophy.
dargelegt hat,
the fact that life, in reality, is a continual prelude to death, namely to this final incomprehensibility, that our thinking and living consciousness will have an end. I believe it is correct to say that to understand this is really beyond what human beings are capable of in their ability to grasp and appreciate what life is. We can tell ourselves that we will no longer be here on this earth in a few years, but to really imagine what this is and will be like is more than man can manage. Now, there is another aspect to the Heraclitean writings. As I have been indicating, I maintain that one of his basic insights is the riddle of life. In Greek, life is psyche, the soul. So the riddle of life is the riddle of the soul, the riddle of wakefulness to which man is called when he awakes. One awakes to existence in the double sense that not only is one there present, but that everything is there present for one. Indeed, Heidegger made this very central to his problem of existence. What is the there in being there? The Da in Dasein. And there is another side to this too, which is also very strongly represented in what has come down to us. And that is the theory that Heraclitus created a cosmology. He is held to have made this from the four well-known elements, which later were first set out by Empedocles: water, air, earth, and fire. Fire is the fourth enigmatic element. If by element we understand a component or ingredient, then it is well known that up until modern times, fire was the great enigma. On what component does fire depend? We all know about the theory of phlogiston, the substance of combustion. That was how one imagined fire before burning was understood as a chemical process. Now, Heraclitus is part of a great line of Greek thinkers. And there is no doubt that if you read Aristotle, who provides us with the best source of information about all this, that these thinkers, the pre-Socratics, were all cosmologists. They were all concerned with the world as a whole, from its beginning perhaps, or perhaps too from its rhythmical return from a condition of chaos into a new world order. It has been said that it was water which in the beginning was everywhere, or that air was everywhere, moving back and forth between wetness and dryness. And so it was said Heraclitus had taken fire as the element which he viewed as the primeval ingredient. Strange as it may sound from a cosmological viewpoint, we sense that it is fire which could be the primeval form of existence. just as the primeval ocean, that is, water, is for us a plausible basis for the transition and transformation of natural life. Let us read fragments 30 and 31 from the Dielsen collection.
Da heißt es: Kosmon tonde, tonoton hapanton, ute testoon, ute anthropon, epoisen.
This world order, the same four in everything, was produced neither by one of the gods nor by a human being.
All ein ai, kai estai, pur aezo.
But rather it always was and is and will be fire. Eternally living, flaring up gradually, and then gradually dying down again.
Flammend, nachmaßend, wieder verlöschend.
We see at once that it is not some cosmogony or other which is being related, but rather something is being said about the role of fire flaring up and dying down. Fire is called aeson, always alive. We might render this the unruly flame, the eternally unruly flame, or the ever-restless flame, this flux of combustion, this flickering flame which rises up out of the combustible substance.
Des Verbrennens, diese fließende Flamme, die aus dem Brennbaren aufsteigt.
Now this is all very odd, that it should be fire of all things, which is connected with world order in the train of thought. Let us read the continuation, fragment 31. The transformations of fire.
Proton thalassa, thalassis de tomen hemusige, to de hemusi prester. Ich übersetze:
The transformations of fire as the first sea. From the sea, half is land, the other half hot wind.
Heißer Wind. Ein Kirchenvater hat das.
One of the church fathers quoted this. And you can imagine, when a church father in the 3rd century AD found in his books Greek writings like this, then he had a definite predilection about how to understand it.
Dann hatte natürlich eine bestimmte Bereitschaft, das zu verstehen. Heißer Wind, das
hot wind, this is already very close to hell.
Da kommt einem sofort
what occurs to one at once is this tremendous image which Christianity, both in the teaching of the resurrection and in the primitive folk beliefs about hell, propagated.
Dem uralten Volksglauben an die Hölle gelehrt hat. Und von diesem
and this fragment goes on.
Von diesem Bericht geht es weiter. Thalassa diachätai, schließlich verläuft
Finally, the sea disperses
das Meer und
assumes the same size as before the earth ever even came to exist.
Von Erde gekommen ist. Ich frage mich wieder rein von der Sache her.
I wonder, purely in the nature of things,
Wie ist denn der
what is the
Zusammenhang von
relationship between
Meer.
land and sea?
Von Wasser und Meer. Es ist das, was wir
It is what we mean when we say in German,
sagen,
it
wenn
is
wir sagen,
drying out,
es fällt trocken.
when the
So
tide
sagen
is
wir,
on the ebb.
wenn Ebbe ist. Ich
In other words, the sea does not extend so far anymore over the land, and thus more land emerges. The land rises up, so to speak, and is separated from the sea. And so it becomes clear what is meant by the hot wind. Because, of course, a hot wind results when the air is not being continually cooled by the sea below, but is reflected back from the land. That is why people go to the seaside in summer, to feel the fresh sea breeze and avoid the heat which is found inland. These are natural phenomena which are being reported in this fragment. In short, I think this example may serve to show that if you want to explain how water comes from fire, then you really have to violently twist the source writings in order to make a real cosmogony out of them. I would really like to know how it can be done at all. On the other hand, could it not be that what is being discussed is the rhythm of the seasons and natural processes, the whole procedure of water, earth, hot wind and dry land, and again water and again earth? All this is caused by the climate, by the sun, by fire. Anyway, I am convinced that purus tropai does not mean that fire is transformed into all this, but rather that these are the changes that fire causes. Perhaps with reference to the same expression which the Greeks used for the course of the sun. They said, the turning of the sun, where in English one would say solstice, the summer solstice and the winter solstice, the fixed extreme points of the sun's course, which indeed determine the order of our seasons, and thereby also the life of the elements. I have gone one step ahead. I have shown that perhaps the fire thesis is not quite so incredible as it at first appears. One can, of course, understand why fire must be one of the elements when one thinks, as the Greeks did too, of course, that where warmth is, the warmness of life, so fire must also be there. Because wherever there is fire, there is heat. Now, of course, this fits in very well with the point of view that there is a rhythm of living in which the processes of life are accomplished, as we have seen in the example of waking and sleeping, and finally in living and dying, and being dead. And I could go on and show you how in all these images of Heraclitus the same basic insight occurs. Whatever changes, by however much, whatever emerges as two antitheses, in reality becomes one. And that is the world, that is the cosmos, that is the universal order, which in all its contradictions can be seen over and over again to return to the same constellation of an ordered course. When I start from this consideration, then it comes as no great surprise to me to discover in the fragments that there is mention of pur phronegon, of rational fire. That is to say, the breath of life is immediately associated with the birth of consciousness and of thinking awareness.
Dem Aufkommen des Bewusstseins und des denkenden Bewusstseins. Das also ist
This is, I suppose, the conclusion that can be drawn from the whole thing. Heraclitus had reflected on existence. He perceived the features of fluctuation in existence. They all derive from the fact that behind the changes of appearance, in the final analysis there emerges the One, and the riddle of life too. Waking, sleeping, living, and the extinguishing of the flame of life.
Und das Erlöschen der Lebensflamme.
I would think that in a thorough interpretation, one might first try to see how far one could get with this perception of the meaning of the Heraclitean propositions, based as it is on a consideration of the facts. If this is done, then I believe, and at the moment I have an extensive work in press on this issue, then I believe one will understand why Heraclitus has so influenced our thinking, particularly the history of German thinking, which is so imbued with the problem and riddle of self-awareness and consciousness. What is consciousness? Measuring, observing with the methods of physical measurement. Oh, we can do that wonderfully today. We can even measure the electric currents which are exchanged in our neural cells and in our nervous system. But can we measure thought? Can we measure consciousness? No. By this method, we can only measure those material changes which take place. That is not the same thing as the changes continually taking place in our imagination and our intelligence. So much is obvious. So I think it is not surprising that the great metaphysicians, such as Hegel, were so attracted by Heraclitus, by the mystery of the one in many. So I see too why Plato was so attracted by this one in many concept, and the concept of the many reverting to a single unity. And so one could and must attempt to place Heraclitus in the context of his Greek world, as to a certain extent I have tried to do. Conversely, the Heraclitean propositions continue to represent an intellectual challenge and an enduring enigma for our own consciousness of existence, in philosophy and in the riddle of life and death.
Immer wieder als einen Kronzeugen Heraklit zitieren lässt.